In the wildlands beyond the frontier, a grieving widow found a wounded Comanche warrior sinking into quicksand. Helping him meant risking everything, her safety, her land, her life. But she didn't hesitate. She dragged him out, stitched his wound, and hid him from the bounty hunters closing in. What she didn't know was, he was the war chief's son. And what happened next changed her place in the world forever. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The sun was burning low over the Arkansas River when Eleanor Price, her orange calico dress stained with mud and her heart still raw from burying her mother 2 weeks ago, stepped off the wagon trail to fetch water and heard a sound that didn't belong. A low, wet thrashing like boots sinking into pudding, and when she followed it through the reeds she found a man waist-deep in quicksand. One arm outstretched, face streaked with mud, eyes fierce and unyielding. A painted feather in his braid and war paint still visible despite the sweat. And though her breath caught in her throat and her first instinct screamed to run, Comanche, her hands moved before her fear did, grabbing a fallen branch, extending it toward him as his free hand clenched around it like a dying man clings to life itself. And she braced her feet and pulled with everything she had, her boots slipping in the wet earth, her muscles trembling as he emerged inch by inch from the mire, until with one last heave, he collapsed at her feet, coughing sand and blood, and she saw then the arrow wound in his side, the broken shaft still lodged deep, and before she could decide if she was saving a man or inviting death, she tore fabric from her petticoat and pressed it to the wound, whispering, "Don't die," even as his eyes rolled back and he went still. She dragged him to her wagon hidden in a grove, used the last of her water to clean his wound, used her own needle to stitch what skin she could, and when he woke the next morning, sun glinting off the river and her rifle resting across her lap, he didn't speak, only watched her like she was something strange, something dangerous or holy, maybe both. And though she told herself she'd let him go once he could walk, something in her chest twisted every time his breath hitched from pain, and she began to ask his name. But he only grunted until she asked again that night while changing the bandage, and he rasped, "Tamako," before falling asleep again. And the next day, when 3 white men rode up on horseback with shotguns slung low, calling out for a squaw killer seen heading this way, Eleanor stood in front of the wagon, heart pounding, hand trembling near her rifle, and lied, said she'd seen nothing but deer and silence for miles. And they rode off laughing, one tossing a coin at her like she was a beggar or worse. And when she turned around, Tamako was gone from the blankets. But she found him crouched behind the wagon, knife drawn, eyes burning with old rage. And for the first time she realized he hadn't trusted her either, not until that moment, when he slowly sheathed the knife and nodded once. That night, as cicadas buzzed and thunder growled far off, he told her in broken English how he'd been ambushed by Texas Rangers, left for dead after killing 2 in defense, how the river took him when he tried to escape, and how she, a stranger in a torn dress, had pulled him from the land's jaws like a spirit come alive. And Eleanor didn't know whether to cry or laugh. So she did both, and when he reached out and touched her hand, calloused fingers brushing mud from her skin, she didn't pull away. 2 days later, as she packed her wagon to leave and he helped her hitch the horse, thinking they'd part ways at the next fork in the trail, they heard screams, and not far, a child's and then a woman's, and Tamako froze, scenting the air, muttering a Comanche word she didn't know, and he was already running before she could ask what it meant, drawing her knife from the wagon and vanishing into the trees. And Eleanor followed, heart in her throat, until they came to a clearing where a group of bounty hunters had a Comanche woman and a small boy tied to a post, jeering, preparing to sell them at the next town, and Eleanor almost screamed. But Tamako didn't hesitate, moving like lightning through shadow, his knife slicing the first man's throat before the others knew he was there. And Eleanor stepped into the open, rifle raised, voice shaking as she ordered the others to drop their weapons. And to her shock, they did. Maybe it was the fire in her eyes. Or maybe they believed a woman who could stand beside a blood-soaked warrior without flinching was not to be crossed. And by the time it was over, 2 men were dead, the others gone running. And the woman, who turned out to be Tamako's sister, embraced him with tears as the boy clung to his leg like he'd found the sun again. And Eleanor stood there, half in shock, until Tamako turned to her, eyes soft, voice low, and said, "You saved me. Again." And in that moment, the distance between them collapsed. Not just the physical, but the centuries of mistrust. The scars between their peoples. And when he asked her to come back with them, to meet his mother, to see the land through his eyes, to live, not just survive, she hesitated, because everything she knew was covered in white lace and dust and buried in coffins. But her heart beat yes, and she nodded, and that night, under stars thick as honey and a fire crackling beside a river that no longer scared her, she leaned into him, into the future, into the risk of something greater than herself. And when they reached his village days later, and elders looked at her with suspicion until Tamako stood tall and spoke of what she'd done, not once, but twice. And the old grandmother placed a beaded necklace around Eleanor's neck and called her Sokai, Fire Hand. She understood that she hadn't just saved a man in the mud, but she'd crossed into a story that would be retold, a bond not written in treaties but in blood, courage, and the choice to see beyond what the world told her was enemy, and find instead a soul reaching out for something as fragile and brave as trust. And years later, when white settlers came again and found her standing beside Tamako with a child at her side and defiance in her eyes, they paused, uncertain, because they saw not a captured woman, but a woman who had chosen, who had pulled a man from the earth, and found herself in the process and never once looked back.